Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's ABNY Talks, Pulse of the New York City Primary. I'm Emma Foman, CEO of the Association for a Better New York, and we're thrilled to have you all here today. So, as a recovering public servant myself, local elections are kind of like my Super Bowl. So, this recent primary was really one for the history books. So, for my first event here at ABNY, I was thrilled to pull together this esteemed panel of experts to help us digest the election results and discuss what they reveal about our city's future. So, I'd really like to welcome Ben Max, who is the program director of the New York Law School Center for New York City Law. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science for Fordham University, Kate Doran, Election Specialist at the League of Women Voters of the City of New York, and last but not least, Teresa Gonzalez, partner at Bolton St. John's and co-chair of the New Majority NYC, and also thrilled to have her as a board member of the ABNY Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today. So, just a few housekeeping notes. We will be recording today's conversation and we'll be sharing on ABNY's YouTube channel following the event. And also, for all of you listening at home, I encourage you to share your questions in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So, this election delivered one of the most stunning upsets in recent New York City history, with Assembly member Zohran Mamdani capturing 56% of the vote after ranked choice voting, surpassing former Governor Andrew Cuomo by 12%. This election was historic, though, in several ways. The total turnout was over 1 million voters. That was the highest in 36 years. Early voting totals reached over 384,000 people, more than doubling the 2021 early voting levels. We saw huge increases in young voters under 40, representing about 40% of early voters, which is also significantly higher than the last election. And we saw 22,000 newly registered voters cast ballots for the very first time. So, with all that in mind, I'll start with you, Professor Greer. What do you think were the main drivers of the high turnout this primary?
So, thank you for having us and congratulations on the new position. Um, I think there are a few things. One, sometimes when we have these highly contentious and divisive elections, it actually does spur turnout. And we know that New York City has been embarrassingly low, especially in primaries, when it comes to people turning out. And so we have to give credit to Zohran Mamdani and his ground game. We talked about this a lot on FAQ NYC. My podcast, Ben Max, talked about it quite a bit on his podcast, where oftentimes the Mamdani campaign was the only campaign you really saw out and about. And so for the last few months, we call it the old school Obama strategy, where when Obama ran, he knew that a lot of voters were already with the Clintons. So it's much harder work, but you have to get new people into the system. So he clearly inspired a lot of young people. He inspired a lot of people to turn out who don't normally turn out in primary elections. We know lots of folks will turn out in a general in November, but a June election when people are trying to figure out, are the kids going to camp? They're in school, like what's happening? It's like the weather's a little miscellaneous. An election just actually isn't oftentimes a primary focus. And so we saw him literally pounding the pavement, going from the top of the Manhattan to the bottom, in all five boroughs, trying to get voters to A, know that there's an election going on, and B, to know some of the issues that are going on. Because there's so much chaos at the top of the government, in the federal government, I actually thought, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that a lot of people might feel like a malaise, a certain level of disgust. And several New Yorkers did feel that. And so some chose to abstain. Some figured they might just go with same old 66 with Andrew Cuomo, the sort of, presumptive nominee, even though he ran a coronation and not a campaign. And Zohran Mamdani, when you talk to voters, he actually woke something up inside of them and inspired them to think about their city as a place where you don't have to accept the status quo. And that sort of became sort of a small ignited fire. And then we saw that it carried him through the finish line on June 24th and then ultimately July 1st.
Love it. What do you think, Ben? What was the biggest
Oh,
factor?
thanks for having me. Yeah, I don't. I think Professor Greer captured a lot there. I was actually going to say something very similar in terms of I was wondering going into this election whether the reelection of Donald Trump and some of the other things in national and local politics, the indictment of Mayor Adams and other things, might have actually sort of really created a Democratic voter malaise, as Dr. Greer just said. And I was thinking going into the election, we might even see a lower turnout than we had in 2021. But clearly, there was something about the Mamdani campaign and the politics of the city, and perhaps again this first post-Trump election opportunity for New York City Democrats to come out and sort of have some outlet for showing their frustration about the results of the presidential election, that might have contributed to this. I do think the campaign that the Mamdani effort ran was remarkable in a number of ways. Dr. Greer touched on some of them. The way that the campaign broke through on social media was incredible. And again, that was not just to the sort of civic minded. This was an effort that really broke through in many ways. The way that the campaign through the candidate activated South Asian voters certainly seems to be a key factor in some of this. And then I would also say, though, it's important to note that Andrew Cuomo got a lot of votes. He outperformed well above what Mayor Adams got in 2021 in his winning campaign. This was a high turnout comparatively election. We still should note that we're still only, at roughly a third of registered Democrats coming out to vote here. But this was, an engaged electorate on a number of fronts. And I think some of that certainly seems to be the response from Democratic voters in the city to having a chance to get out there and vote after another, Trump election.
Mm. Mm.
What do you think, Kate?
Well, first off, thank you very, very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I never call myself an expert. I tend to use the word specialist as in someone who pays attention and tries to make sense of everything. So I want to give a shout out right now to a dear friend who is a member of the League of Women Voters. He was out in California for a while, and he's coming back to New York State. And what he taught me about Get Out the Vote are the 6 C's, the letter C. And here's what they are. And I think that this made a difference in the primary. Compelling candidates, collective concern, and competitive contests. We had all of that in this primary. And I think that's what drove the turnout and among young people and others. And we at the League of Women Voters, this is what we care about. We care about turnout. So it was thrilling for us to see all of that.
Thanks, Kate. I love that. 6 C's. What do you think, Teresa?
So yes, obviously to everything that Ben, Christina, and Kate said, I would add 2 other things. One is, um, similar to his kind of innovative, really exciting, energized way of communicating to voters. I think he also, and his campaign also very much focused on volunteers, right? So you had this army of people out pounding the pavement. I made the joke the other day that Doran volunteers came to my door at least 5 times. And each time I was like, yeah, I get it. I get it. I get it. Right. But and they were young and they were excited and they were energized. So I think that certainly played a factor. The messengers that were out there were really out there. And then I would say something that we don't talk a lot about, which is his willingness to collaborate. I think he understood that this would require a ranked choice strategy. And I think, his engagement, particularly with Brad at the last kind of in the final stretch, was kind of incredible. And I think it did reach a lot of his people, at least. He at some point early on or earlier than that, encouraged people to give to Adrian Adams. Like he had zero concern with seeming as if he was giving away his vote and more of a this is all of us against a common enemy. And I think that really got people to feel like this guy is serious. We can trust him. He clearly wants to work to ensure that like New York remains a place for New Yorkers, a place for that we love. So I do think the kind of ranked choice collaborative approach made some difference particularly in the end.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because I was curious of all of your thoughts on the cross endorsement strategy. It certainly seems to have worked for Mandani and Controller Brad Lander. What do you think we can kind of glean from this strategy? And I'd also like welcome some reflections on why wasn't that cross endorsement strategy used in the last primary in 2021? And do we think that this kind of sets a pattern or a strategy that can be used more extensively in future elections? And I'll open it up. Anyone can chime in.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Teresa said because this cross collaboration that I think inspired a lot of people, it gave Mamdani credibility in sort of different communities. I think that I'm reticent to sort of make a massive prediction for future elections, and I think I have an answer as to why it doesn't necessarily work in past elections. Mamdani was so ahead of everyone else going into June 24th. It didn't cost him anything to be supportive of Adrian Adams. It didn't cost him anything to team up with Brad Lander. I mean, in my estimation, Brad Lander is his Joe Biden to the Barack Obama. Brad Lander gives him credibility. Brad Lander is an adult. Brad Lander has won citywide. Brad Lander does know about money because he's the controller. Brad Lander actually does have the respect of a lot of New Yorkers who don't like Cuomo or Eric Adams, but are maybe a little reticent to support a hyper progressive 33-year-old. So there's a credibility conversation that he has. It's self-serving in some ways, and I say that just genuinely. It's politics. I don't think we saw that in 2021 because the competition was so close. And so, yes, when people say, well, had Maya Wiley or Catherine Garcia dropped out, and then you add in those two women and they would have beaten Eric Adams, it's like, well, both of those women were saying, well, why should I have to drop out? Right? Let's see where it goes. It's a tight race. So I don't want to give up essentially my dream just for something. Fortune favors the bold. And I think after, honestly, 2008, it's shown a lot of candidates. You know, when Zohran Mamdani, I'm sure, told people that he was running, lots of people chuckled. You were a 33-year-old South Asian with very little record, and you run in Albany, not citywide. You're not from Manhattan or Brooklyn. You're from Queens. Like, all of these things don't normally add up to a top tier mayoral candidate winning a Democratic primary against a thrice termed governor who's got millions upon millions of dollars in his coffers and billionaires funding his campaign. And his father was a thrice termed governor who has still a lot of goodwill and respect in Black and Latino high voting turnout neighborhoods. So the ground game that all of us are talking about, this ability and willingness to talk across different communities and to build coalitions, is a fantastic strategy, and it worked effortlessly and beautifully. But it's also because he was polling light years ahead of Brad Lander, light years ahead of Adrian Adams and everyone else. And we saw in the data when it came out, I think Brad Lander was the only candidate who actually broke double digits when you add him up with Mamdani and Cuomo. Everyone else, not only were they in single digits, they were in very low single digits. And we saw that his cross endorsement with Michael Blake was almost a blip because Bronx did not switch over for him.
I
I would.
would,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ben.
no, please.
No, I would also say 2021 is people were still kind of figuring out ranked choice, right? They were like, what
Yes.
do we like this? I'm not sure what this means, right? So like fast forward to now where we've had an opportunity, there's been education, people have used it, they see what it looks like. And then there were these campaigns built upon or strategies inserted into these campaigns that said, hey, there's a ranked choice strategy. Here's what it looks like. I just also think the timing made it easier to be able to lean in on that because we hadn't used it before in this way.
Yeah,
We
I
have
mean, I
all of
think
these compelling candidates. And, they figured out a way to really, really make use of ranked choice voting. We were very pleased to see it. This is what we had envisioned when we supported it originally, that there would be collaborations, there would be endorsements. So,
That's right. Definitely growing pains. Go ahead, Ben.
I think there was a lot of wariness in 2021 about ranked choice alliances in the first election. There were particularities to who the candidates were and some of the issues involved. It seems very clear, something I and many others have been saying since 2021 that if Catherine Garcia and Maya Wiley had cross-endorsed each other, one of them would be mayor right now. And this is something that Brad Lander's been saying in recent weeks after the decision to cross-endorse with Mamdani, and I think it's completely accurate. People should, of course, remember going back to 2021 that Maya Wiley actually got the second most first-place votes in that election. She seemed leery of teaming up with Garcia for different reasons, and we don't know the full story of how those talks broke down. But clearly, there were many candidates, interest groups, and others that came away from 2021 saying candidates should probably do a much better job in 2025 at ranked choice alliances, and we saw some of that play out. This is also, though, I think, speaks very much to the first topic we discussed, which is the turnout and the excitement around the Mamdani campaign. As Dr. Greer has been making parallels to Barack Obama, I mean, this is very much a hope and change election, a hope and change candidate doing politics differently. And part of that is the ranked choice alliances. Part of that is promoting the slate. Part of that is doing videos, asking people to donate to Adrian Adams. It's all of those things that Mamdani did that built up so much goodwill among other candidates, among the electorate, that helped him. I don't, I'm fairly skeptical that the alliance with Brad Lander had as big of a positive impact for Mamdani as it's being made out to have had. I think he was on his way to winning this election either way. And I know people aren't saying he won because of the alliance, but I think, I'm not sure how much impact that ultimately had, although Mamdani did pick up about twice as many votes in the ranked choice runoff than Cuomo. But I think that was sort of baked in almost already. But there was, as Dr. Greer said, a lot that lended credibility to Mamdani after the cross endorsement. But I think it also just lent this narrative to the campaign that it was everybody against Cuomo, more or less, and how the electorate sort of took that in.
And can I just add something? And I think, Ben, uh, the pre sort of team up between Brad Lander and Mamdani may not have added to the primary, but I do think that going into the general, the Mamdani Brad Lander cross endorsement does mean something to some people who are skeptical about his youth and inexperience. I also think that for this kind of conservative Democrat slash, we know that there's going to be a lot of money spent to discredit and a lot of misinformation and disinformation that will be targeted towards Mamdani. I'm looking at you, New York Times. I think that, when we see this campaign and this candidacy, Mamdani, the difference between, say, a Mamdani and Obama, where I constantly kind of compare them, the difference between the two is that, there was this fear that Obama was this African born Muslim who's progressive. And Mamdani is an African born Muslim who is progressive. Obama's not progressive. Like, his skin color is progressive. That's like literally the only thing progressive about Obama. And people put their sort of assumptions on him, but none of his policies are. This is actually talking about wealth redistribution. And I think this is why we're seeing a lot of Democrats, especially Democratic elites and elected Democrats. I'm looking at you, Hakeem, and Kirsten, and
Mhm.
Chuck. I'm looking at all of you sort of refusing to endorse and get behind the Democratic nominee, big D Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York City, because this is someone who has a value system that is actually different from the big tent Democrats, who actually is talking about wealth redistribution, who actually is talking about serious progressive ideals. And we have to recognize that New York has been purple for a very long time. Just because we always sort of go with the Democrat for the presidential nomination, it's New York that lost the 4 seats in Congress where Joe Biden didn't have unified government. It's New York that, consistently gets more and more conservative when, we go to the ballot box. It's New York that had 20 years of Republican mayors. It's New York, that had 3 terms of George Pataki. So this idea that we're this hyper progressive city is actually a myth that I think other people from outside put on us. But I think we can look at the Upper East Side, parts of the Upper West Side, the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, a lot of Queens, Staten Island. I mean, the list goes on and on that shows that we are just varying shades of blue, lots of purple, and some deep pockets of red as well.
I love that. I'm going to take that transition to chat more about geographic trends. So there's been a lot of ink spilled over the last 2 weeks about how Mamdani really rewrote the Democratic political map in New York. Mamdani obviously led in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens. Cuomo won in the Bronx and Staten Island. But drilling down locally, what do you all see as the most influential neighborhoods, particularly that changed since 2021? But echoing your point about the lot of blue, but a lot more purple and red.
I would say I was the most. I'll say what I was the most surprised by. I think I was the most surprised by uh, Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood. For me, that was, in past elections, certainly in 2021, and in the national election, and we've seen historically, tends to be uh, a moderate Democrat, right? And there was a lot of speculation that that's Cuomo's, right? It's Cuomo's. Like he got the endorsement of Adriano Espaillat. Adriano Espaillat covers those areas. He got the endorsement of uh, a number of state elected officials that represent Harlem. And so the fact that Mamdani was able to kind of gather those neighborhoods was a real surprise, I think. Pleasant surprise, but surprise nonetheless. And I think we should watch them closely. It also says a lot about what we know or think we believe about the the demographic kind of tendency, right? Latinos tend to are up there in Washington Heights and Inwood, and when everybody thinks about Latinos, they think moderate Democrat. But let me tell you, Hamdani really kind of cinched them as well. And so I think for me, those were the two neighborhoods. And then I would say kind of the Beds, although not as surprising, but Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, Ridgewood areas were really interesting. And then in the number of areas in Queens, like your Jackson Heights,
Woodside.
Hills. Yeah, I feel like, again, there was a lot on my part, I'll speak for myself, a lot of speculation that these are homeowners historically moderate in their voting that would go to Cuomo at the very least, right? Or Adrian. Adrian happens to represent Queens. But the fact that Mamdani was able to really kind of scoop them up, I think, was a real surprise. I wasn't expecting.
I thought I echo that, and I would say the Mamdani performance in many predominantly Latino areas was one of the biggest surprises to me. Certainly, it's still fascinating to look at some of the differences, though, where you still have Cuomo doing much better in heavily Latino areas of the Bronx, but Mamdani doing better in Queens. Maybe that's some of that is because he's from Queens, but there could be other differences there too. But I think it also gets at this idea that I've been trying to argue this for a while that we're still too stuck in our New York City political conversation about the ideological lanes. And, maybe this helps break us out of that a bit more, that, Mamdani really was running a campaign that, as much as he didn't deny being a democratic socialist and wanting, of course, to, increase tax rates and things like that, he was running a broadly sort of just populist campaign. And he was speaking to a lot of people who either voted for Donald Trump or were, sort of Trump curious in similar ways. He was doing it from the left, but Trump, and Trump was doing it from the right in most cases, but sometimes not. And the idea that he really just leaned into people's material concerns and the cost of living, and especially the way Trump ran the first time, this idea that like the status quo is just broken and the people from both parties that got you here need to be in the past. I think that spoke to a lot of people. And I'll just add briefly, I also thought Mamdani's performance in parts of Manhattan that are actually whiter areas of Manhattan and wealthier was remarkable. That I think needs some more digging into and some more attention as someone running on raising taxes and doing more socialism. Appeal to voters who you wouldn't think ideologically are there. I think that's worth a bit more conversation as well.
And he spoke to them in their language, Ben, right? Like when we talk about the Latino, mobilizing the Latino vote, like even the jokey little video he put out with him speaking in Spanish, that matters to people. That attempt matters to people. I would also say you can draw similarities between when we think about what resonated there was all the speculation that public safety would be it. Public safety would be it. It's public safety. Everybody cares about that. But I found it fascinating that what you saw was what you very much heard during the national election, which was, I need to be able to afford to live here. I need to feed my family, right? And so the economy, which we now, we like to use that, or not use, but we oftentimes refer to that as what won the national election for Trump, right? Is this conversation around economy and his ability to kind of appeal to that. You saw happen here in this kind of race, in Zoran's kind of gaining momentum. Is it was about affordability. It really was. I mean, he touched on a few times on, in fact, anytime he'd have a conversation or anybody would ask him about NYPD, he pivoted to community, and then he pivoted to being able to, like, well, we need to be able to live here first. Like, let's focus on making sure that New Yorkers can stay here. And let's think about working collaboratively. So I do think another fascinating aspect of that is it was the same concept, right? Essentially, that we saw Trump use during the national election.
I agree. I also think, and Emma knows this from Intro to Politics with Professor Greer, voters go to the polls based on pocketbook issues. And when we think about the campaigns that were run, Adrian Adams gets in way too late. Scott Stringer's just kind of showing up, jeans and a t-shirt. We're not really sure what's happening here. Brad Lander, he's not for everybody. I say he's like okra, right? It's like either you like him or you don't. But no one else really had a clear message. When you saw Mamdani, you knew he was going to talk about affordable housing, affordability, and buses. Like 1, 2, and 3. There's a message, there's a takeaway, even if you don't know him, even if you don't like him. And I think, I agree with what Ben and Teresa have said, Trump from the right, Mamdani from the left. But when people talk about the economy, most Americans and most New Yorkers have no idea what that means. What Mamdani did, and he was one of the few campaigns, again, that we saw on the ground. We saw his surrogates on the ground. We had to tell his volunteers, stop breaking into our building. We don't let people in if we don't buzz you in. I mean, they were that aggressive, making sure that, the door tags were on the doors. But he was constantly going back to, I will spend time talking to anyone to ask you, do you feel better now than you did? Do you feel like you can stay in the city? Do you feel like you can afford it? I want to have an additive conversation. I don't want to take things away from you. I want to add free buses. I want to add sort of housing. I want to add things to your life to make your life easier so you can stay here. That's a very attractive message. And when a lot of people feel beaten down by the federal government, with a lot of negativity also, and this isn't, just purely a fiscal conversation. Some of it is an emotional conversation. He is tapping into a positive aspect that New Yorkers want to get back to. And he's saying, trust me, right? We took a chance on someone else and he's a mess. So if you take a chance on me, I'm actually trying to work. And I think for some people, and Ben, this goes back to, conversations we've had, the campaign phase is not the same as the governance phase. But I do think that some people respect the fact that we saw such a well-run campaign. It does give you possibly a glimmer into, could you actually have good governance because of your lack of discipline, or because of your discipline and organization on a campaigning level. It does actually pique the interest of people who are saying, well, maybe you could deliver on some of these promises. A lot of people don't know how the federal government works and the state government and Albany. But it is this glimmer of hope. And the people I talked to said he woke something up in them and gave them the possibility that New York could be this thing that they want and that they could actually stay and fight for.
Just quickly to add briefly to a couple of things that were said, I do think part of the key to what happened here is that crime has been going down. And there were not a lot of headlines about crime increases, about violent incidents. For the most part, in the run up to primary day, there were no big random attack storylines, headlines. Mamdani got a very favorable environment for his focus on affordability. Also, the migrant crisis has basically, quote unquote, ended in terms of the flow of new arrivals to the city that was dominating so much of the headlines and the, questions about management in the city. So there were a number of factors that also helped his discipline and his focus on the number one issue to voters. And polls showed over and over again this was the case, and it was the big takeaway for Democrats coming out of 2024 was inflation and cost of living. And somehow Mamdani was the only candidate that really ran on that. I think were key, and also this theme of anti-incumbency and the way that Andrew Cuomo's candidacy did step in as the proxy for incumbency, with the current mayor obviously skipping the Democratic primary, was another of these markers of sort of throw the bums out, atmosphere in the city.
So all of you hit on the obvious theme that the Mamdani camp had on affordability. What did we see? And Teresa, you just teased this in an earlier answer. What did we see in the voting split across renters and homeowners? Does that break down that line, homeowners versus renters, or what were the sort of nuances to that in the data we've seen so far?
I think Christina might have actually teased it first, so I want to give credit where it's due. But I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I would imagine if we're looking at a young electorate, um, um, right, youngest turnout, or sorry, most turnout of young voters that we've seen in a long time. Um, a lot from Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, and I hate to be stereotypical about it, but like we're looking at renters, right? We're looking at folks who are not quite homeowners yet, or who are clearly a few years away from doing that. So I would imagine that the number of renters participating in this, and the fact that we have been talking about, freeze the rent was a big deal for him, um, and that we've been talking about that for quite a while. We just, let's not forget that we just passed as well. Not we, but the city council just passed City of Yes, right? So like, there's still this kind of momentum and energy around uh, uh, apartments and the ability to afford to live here in an apartment. You have this young voter base, include volunteers in that number, and you're talking thousands and thousands of renters. And then you start to think about the neighborhoods that we're talking about, and it tends to be that is the leaning in those neighborhoods. I don't know what the numbers are, but I would venture to guess that you would probably have seen a lot more on the renter side.
Yeah, the numbers definitely show that, and then areas of the city definitely show that. And again, I think it's important to point out, there were hundreds of thousands of votes for Andrew Cuomo from largely homeowning areas of the city, and people who are probably more drawn towards experience and thinking about things like safety and order and things like that. That you have this breakdown, but I think Teresa just also got at this key point about the Mamdani freeze the rent focus. Again, very debatable about whether this is good policy, but it's certainly good politics. And I do wonder how many voters either thought when he was running on freeze the rent that he was talking about market, apartments, not just rent
Right.
stabilized, but also even if they didn't, just this idea as a proxy for what he stands for and the sort of energy of the campaign being about being on the side of the renters, certainly was a key factor.
For sure. So we also saw, just going back to demographics, I want to talk a little bit about the youth vote that some of you have touched on. So the average voter in 2021 was 54 years old. Given the latest data, people under 40 represent almost half of the early votes from this last primary, almost doubling from 2021. We've talked ad nauseum already about how Mamdani was able to really mobilize this historic level of young voters. Do we think that they're here to stay, or do we think that they're tied to his candidacy singularly? Talk to me about the future of the youth vote.
Well, I can say that I'm a poll worker. I worked on election day. I did not work at early voting, but I was really, really astonished at the number of young people who came through. That was not my typical experience. It would be a mix of all sort of ages. And I was playing a game with myself and looking at my poll pad when I was signing people in. Is this person anywhere close to my age? And they were, are they younger than my kids? And they were predominantly young people. We had a couple of brand new voters too, people who got applause voting for the very first time. It was very exciting. And so I would say, I hope they're going to be around. I expect them to turn out in November, but that's my own take on it.
Some helpful on the ground
Yeah,
notes.
yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
Oh no, I was going to say, oh, they'll turn out this November. I think that's pretty certain. I think the question
Sure.
is whether it's Mamdani dependent, or who sort of can continue to capture and energize. And obviously, if he wins, and we have a whole general election ahead of us, but can he deliver to not disillusion the voters that put him into office? And what does that look like? We can obviously hold off on that for a while, but I do think this idea of bringing new voters out to the poll or re-engaging polls or re-engaging voters who have been sort of dismissive of politics because people aren't speaking to them and their needs, you have to obviously then get into office and deliver to keep those people around and engaged.
Yeah, I think, I definitely think that they're going to stick around until November. Do they stick around for a primary next year when it's a gubernatorial race? I don't know. Do they stick around for the general next year when it's a governor's general? I'm not sure. Sadly, there are a lot of people who are new to politics where if their candidate doesn't win, then they want to pack up their marbles and go home for good. So it's like a one-shot deal. So like, luckily, it looks right now pretty good that he could get across the finish line. Asterisk. But if he doesn't, then there are a lot of people who tend to be disillusioned and then they want to walk away. I think the second piece is a large part of his coalition, rephrase, a large part of his base, the DSA groups, tend to be folks who believe in purity politics. And so politics is based on compromise. And there will be some compromises that he will have to make if he is elected. And, my co-host Harry Siegel and I interviewed some folks who have worked with him for our podcast, FAQ, and it was a great exchange, debate, conversation, whatever you want to call it, where someone says, well, actually, is compromise necessary? I don't think that candidates have to compromise. Now, as a professor of politics, I don't know how you get anything done without politics and compromise because it's 9 million of us. And so, yes, I understand that people elect you on a promise that you made in February of 2025, but there may be a situation in March of 2028 where you might have to pivot. You might have to shift a little bit to the center or the right or whatever it's called, or you might have to hire people that aren't ideal to the far left DSA that help get you to the dance. And so this is where I think some of the tension will arise because there are some people who understand compromise is necessary in politics. And there are other folks who believe if I don't get every single thing on my list from this individual that he promised, then I don't want to play the game anymore. And that's actually not what politics is. Now, is this going to be a newfangled 21st century version of politics that I'm unaware of? Maybe. I highly doubt it. But I do think that thus far, it doesn't seem as though Mamdani has painted himself into a box where he can't get out of it because he said he's willing to have conversations with non-DSA members. He said he's willing to have conversations with people from the Bloomberg administration or the de Blasio administration, essentially adults at the table. But it'll be curious to see if his hardcore base, who's with him from the very beginning, is actually on the same page when it comes to that open tent that he's trying to build going into November.
Christina, I think that's it. That compromise point, I think, is for me the it here, right? He will have to, in order to appeal to and be more inclusive in this campaign as we walk into the general, he is going to have to veer slightly to the center, whether he likes it or not, if he wants to win, right? And there will be a lot of his base who are purists and are not going to be happy about that. I have a theory that tends to create new candidates, right? So we may see an increase in civic engagement, generally speaking, because of this. I think the big trend in my head that keeps popping up is, yes, voters, and maybe that'll carry forth, although I'm with you, Christina, I don't know about next primary, but I do think that this kind of energizing of a younger voter base has created folks who, taking off from the past kind of disappointment of the national election, right? These were all people who were like 14 when their parents were dragging them out to rallies and Kamala, right, things and events and Zooms, now coming into their own and being excited and picking up the mantle and saying, like, we can keep this energy going even though we lost here. I think that they will certainly not, they may not become regular voters, but I do think it's energizing um, a base that may take that to, running for office. I mean, we have the youngest city council member in Councilmember Chiose in Bed-Stuy. I think he has actually said in interviews that he was energized by previous elections, right? Because he saw, and quite frankly, Black Lives Matter and all of these things that made him realize I can do something. So I think the trend in my head is not going to be, will these folks vote more or participate in more primaries? I think the trend in my head is going to be, we may see more elected officials come out of this. Or
Which
may,
I love. And
Yeah.
I, as a political science professor, I absolutely love that. I think though that there's a interesting percentage of these people, let's just say, let's back it up a few months to 2024, who had such purity politics where Kamala Harris didn't check every single box that they wanted on
very
international
true.
politics, and they picked up their marbles and left, and now we have what we have. So
Yep.
it's like, if you want to be at the grown-up table, I would argue that you have to understand that, and maybe it's just because I'm Black, right? And it's like, as a Black person in America, I know I don't get everything that I want. I know I have to make strategic decisions. I know I have to think about others when I go to the polls. And so there's a long legacy of Black Americans in voting. And so to me, the frustration is, and it's not about a young youth piece, it's about a purity politics piece where it's like, are you thinking about others? Where it's like, I have never had the luxury of being a single issue voter. I don't think that that's what Mamdani is promising, but I do think that there's a percentage of his supporters who were so single issue purity politics voters where if they don't get everything that they want, then they want to just leave the game. And I think that that's a privilege and a luxury that many people don't have. And it's unfair for the big D and small d democratic process to actually continue when you have such a significant percentage of people who think that way and can control elections one way or the other.
Yep, agreed on that.
So who do the candidates for the general need to be going after from age demographics, geographic location, number of times voting? Who are the targets for this set of 5 candidates for the general?
Well, I can start by saying so much of the answer to this depends on whether Andrew Cuomo is running or not, right? It seems, I mean, any of this could change at any moment, but it seems right now like Eric Adams isn't going anywhere and Curtis Lee was not going anywhere. So the question really is, does Andrew Cuomo run a campaign or does he just have his ballot line, which can't be changed at this point, but not run a campaign? In that case, he gets, a couple percentage points of people doing a protest vote, but he doesn't campaign and doesn't get some percentage that could be even up to a winning percentage. Let's say Cuomo doesn't run for a moment, run a campaign, then obviously his supporters from the Democratic primary become in that swing category. Now, a lot of them will migrate to the Democratic nominee, but certainly when you have a Democratic mayor running as an independent in the general election, some may gravitate towards Eric Adams. And then some might be looking around a little bit. Some might stay home. Curtis Lewa is not a typical Republican. He says Eric Adams is the Trump candidate in the race, not him. So maybe there's some people that look his way. Probably not too many, but some of Cuomo's sort of outer borough white moderate support might go to Curtis Lewa. But clearly Cuomo support among Black voters. Can Eric Adams resuscitate his terribly low approval numbers among Black voters and other supporters he had in the past, including Latino voters? There's some big question marks there, but certainly it's, you start with kind of the Cuomo primary voters and what percentage of them are gettable for Zohran Mamdani in the general election, and does Eric Adams have a chance to sort of regain some of his coalition? I don't think he should be underestimated here, even though his numbers look really bad.
Agreed.
I mean, I'm
Right.
going to say first things first, Mamdani has to get Black people. I mean, young Black people are interesting, but like the base of the Democratic Party is older Black people. And so he didn't bother going after them. Again, I wouldn't either if I were him. It's very clear that Black voters and all their elected leaders and all the Black elites told them to go with Andrew Cuomo, a known quantity. Mario Cuomo, very well respected, still, older Black voters still talk about Mario Cuomo like he was around yesterday. So if I'm Mamdani and have a short window of time, I'm not going after people who are so calcified with a candidate that they know and trust with an asterisk. But it's strategic. But I do think that there is an opportunity for him to have conversations with older, established Black voters, homeowners, people in Brooklyn and Queens. I think the hardest thing that he will have to combat is the misinformation and disinformation that will be put on Facebook and in barbershops and places where older Black people get their information, because it is very clear that people, not just like Bill Ackman or the millionaire and billionaire class, but even established media elites, New York Times, will sort of aid and abet that type of behavior to provide misinformation and disinformation about the Democratic nominee.
One more quick thing here. There's 1 million plus independent voters now in play, right? Unaffiliated with a party. I think the numbers show that a significant portion, maybe something like 40%, is younger voters who have been disillusioned by both parties. So as much as people might quickly be thinking, oh, the general election becomes, more moderate to conservative, which of course it does. You throw in another 500,000 Republicans. And then, of course, there's Democrats who didn't vote in the primary. But those independents, many of them might actually migrate towards Mamdani. They didn't have a chance to weigh in the primary, but many of them are in play for him. So it's, he's clearly the favorite in the general election, and some of it, again, will depend on Andrew Cuomo's decision. But, I think those independent voters are also in this category you asked about, Emma, about, who are the sort of swing opportunities. And then I'll also just add to the list, there's the areas, again, in Manhattan where Cuomo did well, that I think are pretty interesting in terms of whether Eric Adams can win back some of that support.
Oh, thank you, Ben, for mentioning the unaffiliated voter. I don't know if any of you remember John Flatteau. Did you know him, Christina? John Flatteau was the Brooklyn Democratic Commissioner for several years, and sadly he died fairly recently. And he was always willing to sort of pull back the curtain and say what was going on. And the commissioners of elections in every county are represented by an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. The New York City Board of Elections operates as one board. So there are 10, unlike every other county in the state, which has one Democrat, one Republican. And John Flatteau was willing to stand up at a public meeting once, and he said, and he's talking about his colleagues, the Republicans sitting next to him, and he's saying, the largest number of voters in New York City are Democrats. The second largest number of voters in New York City, they ain't the Republicans, and yet we've got 5 people here taking care of the Republicans in New York City. The second largest group of voters in New York City are the unaffiliated voters. And there's nobody at the Board of Elections who pays any attention to them, except, at the general election, they, send them notice that the election is going to happen and their votes are recorded and the voter files are updated. But the unaffiliated voters are very, very important in any general election.
These are both really good points, especially as the Charter Revision Commission is reviewing proposals for open primaries. There's certainly that conversation has heated up this week, but for those who aren't aware, the Charter Revision is reviewing 2 electoral proposals as well as a number of affordable housing related proposals. The first is lining up even year elections to align with presidential elections as a way to boost turnout, and also opening primaries to those who are not currently registered with a political party. What do we think?
You go first. Any one of you.
What do you think, Ben?
I can start. Well, we'll see if the Charter Commission actually puts the open primaries on the ballot. We'll see. They're obviously leaning towards it, it seems, but they still are deciding. I just personally have a lot of hesitation about the move to even year elections. I like more turnout, but I don't like the idea of the New York City mayoral race, and especially down ballot New York City races getting sort of swamped out by a presidential election or a gubernatorial election and congressional election. So I have So I'm concerned about that, even though I love the idea, of course, of more participation. I'm very troubled by how low our turnout rates are,
Mm.
especially in city elections. So that one, feels like a tricky balance to strike there. I like the idea of New York City elections getting all the attention in the New York City electoral year, but then we still don't see enough New Yorkers care, which really drives me crazy,
Yeah.
of course. The open primaries, again, more participation is a good thing. Open the primary up and then let the top two, I would maybe prefer three, advance to the general is an exciting possibility. It's obviously done in many other major cities and in some states. And then you get, a really great general election with these top two candidates coming out of the open primary, and you really get to see a real campaign between them. My only caveat on that is I always, I sort of laugh at this idea that like all these voters are shut out from the process. It's like, well, you can register as a Democrat and then you get to vote.
Right,
It's
right.
not that complicated. But the idea again of more participation, more focus on, especially if you get to that general and you get those top two, would be really good and exciting for a conversation among New Yorkers to really home in on who would be the best leader for the city or best other officials down ballot as well.
Yeah, we're always looking for higher voter participation and turnout. And I don't know that the evidence is really clear that the open primary is going to make that much difference. Um, I can tell you something that's a little bit iconoclastic, but voters vote, I think, when they're more likely to vote when they're angry or frustrated and we've got a lot of fat and happy voters, I think, and they're not they haven't developed a habit of voting. They haven't found an issue that really matters to them. When we try to register very young voters, they say, oh, voting is for people like you. And I'm not talking just because I'm a white lady of a certain age. I'm talking about, any kind of a high school kid. They say, no, that's for other people. It has nothing to do with me. And then the third thing I would say is that voting is a chore. And we really need to face up to that. I mean, you don't want to walk into the polls and look at that ballot and feel like, oh, this is a test I haven't studied for. Oh my God, that's a terrifying, stressful feeling. And people who are going to vote, I believe they want to vote responsibly. They take the um, franchise seriously, which means they have to prepare. They have to study up a little bit. They may, just Google their candidates, or they may actually go and listen to somebody talk. But they do have to do some homework. It's a chore, and I believe that they're not angry. Their lives are going along, humming along, and they don't feel like, it's not going to matter. I don't have to go and work that hard to go vote. So I don't know whether either um, open primaries or even your elections will make that much of a difference, because you may have to work even harder. You may have to study up more.
So I don't disagree with you, Kate, that, voting is, especially for people who don't do it often, it's scary, right? Because you don't know your district. You can walk in there and you don't really know where to go. And, as Teresa mentioned earlier, like half of your ballot is ranked choice, half of it is not. So, there's a lack of voter education, I think, that still occurs. And there are these invisible boundaries that keep people out. You mentioned the sort of fat and happy voter. I would say that we have part of the problem, to Emma's question, is the fat and happy elected. We
Yeah.
have far too many people who just keep going to the polls. Andrew Cuomo's 67. You'd be the oldest mayor in the history of New York. There are a lot of people who don't know what else to do if they're not an elected official. So once they get term limited out of city council, then let me just swing by Albany, right? I'm in Albany, and then it's like, oh, let me just swap a seat with somebody in the city council. There are people who have been around for too long, I would argue, and this is a Democratic problem. And I would say, the problem that we really need to have in the Black community is like we have far too many Black electeds who I would say are the march of the dinosaurs. You have served us valiantly, and public service is real, but there is no baton passing. So part of what actually inspires people to go out and vote are young people who are inspiring to come out to vote. Part of
Mhm.
it is, yes, I do think Mamdani is a once in a generation type candidate. I'll give him that. He is dynamic on a whole host of levels. But part of it is this man is walking from the top of Manhattan to the bottom. He's walking 14 miles in a day because he wants to talk to as many people. He wants to feel the energy of New York. You're not getting that. And God bless Charlie Rangel. You'll never hear me say a bad word about Charlie Rangel. But having any elected for 46 years is too much. And it creates a malaise of the voters because there's an assumption that they'll just get elected. So why do I need to participate? Because they're there. They are like the permanent fixture in your life. So we have, I think, in Black communities, far too many electeds in seats where you automatically get elected, and there's an assumption that I automatically get elected, and I'll pass the baton when I'm good, old, and ready. And so it's the same names cycling. It's a lack of new energy, and you see young people trying to come in and they get extinguished. And so then it sends a message, a rippling message to a lot of young people: don't try, don't do it. And so even though people recognize that they want to be of service, they want to be in their communities, they want to be public servants, they get pushed aside and say, wait your turn. So part of me is, in my thinking, the best way to get people involved is to actually have this regenerative process. So having a city council where after 8 years you got a boogie, but at the same time, we're now just seeing people from Albany coming to city council. And don't get me wrong, I love Gail Brewer. Gail Brewer knows I love Gail Brewer. But there's no reason why Gail Brewer should be an elected official right now. She has served the Upper West Side in a way that she should go down in the history books. Why are you not passing the baton to someone, I don't know, in their 50s? Or their 40s, or God forbid, their 30s. So then you can have a new generation of people on the Upper West Side who care about the community. This goes for Harlem. This goes for so many neighborhoods in New York City. And so part of the Mamdani energy isn't just who he is and he's young, but it's like, but he's also new and he's taking a baton from people. And I think that is part of it. And, Ben, with the percentages, we'll never really know like people's like real motivations. But for some people, it's like, yeah, it's nice to see somebody who hasn't been here for 3 decades running for office.
Well, he's leaving a job where there are no term limits.
Right. He could be there forever. The governor could be there forever. I mean, like, and that's, I think, part of, my intro to politics students asking this all the time. We've got a Supreme Court. You could be there forever. You've got a Congress. You could be there forever. Now we've got a presidency who wants to be here forever. Right. And so, like, there are far too many offices, I think, where people could be here for a very long time. And there's great things about seniority and fundraising and connections and what you can deliver for your community. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I don't understand how a lot of these electeds don't have a succession plan. Why aren't you grooming, in the positive way, grooming a successor or a series of successors? Let them fight it out. But at least you have 5 quality people who have served under you, who actually understand the district and what needs to be done. And I think that, to me, if we want interesting people to get involved in the voting process, we have to have interesting people involved in the candidacy process.
Christina, get out of my head. I yelled this. I do the shaking.
This is why we dress alike.
Well, you've
I
also
literally have this conversation with everybody I know, which is, why can we not have a succession plan for the majority of offices where people have been there for 20, 30 years? I don't understand.
But you've also, I mean, there's term limits in the city council, but with new majority, you have helped work with others to, bring in a new generation of leadership in a lot of ways. That's been interesting and gets to some other interesting city council races that we're obviously not going to talk about now. But just to build on one thing Christina said very quickly is, in some ways, Andrew Cuomo did much better than Andrew Cuomo should have done, right? With his baggage and his scandals and his background, to still do as well, showed a little bit of a yearning, I think, in the electorate, worry about Mamdani perhaps, and a yearning for experience and people that some voters do know and have relationship with. And so you need other sort of establishment figures, again, who are not so scandal tainted, have experience, but again, are not hanging on too long, right? And that's where there should be a lot of soul searching among the quote unquote establishment coming out of this primary around why was Andrew Cuomo your candidate, and, how to figure out better moderates with experience to get behind, or you're going to continue to sort of have your election lunch eaten by, the young upstarts.
With no experience. I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, the pendulum swung because Andrew Cuomo, as problematic as he may be, a lot of folks were like, but he knows government, right? I don't think he knows New York City, but he knows government. I'll give him that, right? He's been around since he was 19 years old. So it's like, so the two options are a 33-year-old who's been in office for 20 minutes, who's never been elected citywide, and we're not sure that he knows much about anything when it comes to governance, or a 67-year-old who's been around since he was 19 years old, and we've got 13 accusations against him, and the nursing homes, and you've got some besties who are in prison, and you've got your own little levels of corruption. Like, these can't be the only two options for voters when it comes to politics.
And this is a failure of the Democratic Party not building a bench.
Well, who's in charge of the Democratic Party? It's like the Headless Horseman.
No,
It feels like Columbia University over here. Who is in charge?
it's literally like there's a hamster in a wheel somewhere. That's like, it's me.
Now, on that
Somebody is
note,
typically-
we are at time, but I want this is maybe if only a question if folks are truly brave enough. But knowing that we're at time, I'd love to do a lightning round of your predictions for November's general election. Who is our next mayor?
I mean, I don't want to make any, big predictions. I'll say what I think sitting here today, and it's July 8th, so a lot can change very
Heard
quickly.
here, July 8th.
But I mean, I think you have to assess the primary and the polling we've seen and the mayor's favorability numbers and all of that, and say that Mamdani is a very strong favorite in the general election. Though you do get some polling. Again, the polling was way off in the primary for the most part, so who knows how much stock we want to put into it. You clearly have a section of the Democratic electorate plus a whole bunch of others that maybe won't vote for him. So, he seems like a very strong favorite, but, some of it goes back to what I said earlier about Cuomo's decision and whether he'll fracture, the opposition forces. But I don't see any indications at this moment that Mamdani won't be the next mayor.
Agreed.
And
Teresa, go ahead.
my prediction is that we will have a really, really good, strong turnout because we've got all of those compelling candidates, right? And collective concern about housing, affordability, all the rest of that stuff. We're excited. I think we're going to have a big turnout.
Good answer, Kate.
Yeah, it's a real general election. That's good.
Yeah.
That's right. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for taking the time today. And we will be sharing this recording for those who want to watch it again. I'm sure folks will because there was so much great content. And it will be on our YouTube channel early next week. But thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody.
Ciao.